Okay, so this evening we are going to receive a presentation from Rory Macklin. Um, the title of the presentation, as you can see, is Citizen Science Reveals Potential Impact of Vessel Activity on Overwintering Coastal Waterbird Population Trends in the Salish Sea. If you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat. I will monitor those and we can discuss them at the end. A little bio about Rory. I'm going to read it here. Rory Macklin is a data analyst with Birds Canada, having recently completed his master's in zoology at the University of British Columbia. Having grown up on the British Columbia coast, Rory is broadly interested in the conservation of biodiversity and the beauty of this region. Okay, Rory, I've got nothing else to say, so over to you.
Cool. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much to Toby for inviting me here to speak, and for all of you to come and to watch tonight. It's been a great time working with the folks at the Puget Sound Seabird Survey at the observatory, and I'm really excited to get to share some of our results with the people who've made it all possible. Today, I'll be talking about a project that we're undertaking here at Birds Canada in partnership with the Puget Sound Bird Observatory, looking at one of the many threats to coastal water birds. And we'll talk about how your work and our programs north of the border are helping to identify particularly vulnerable species and drive conservation. A bit of a caveat going into the presentation today. The results presented here are currently under revision, so they're not the final picture of what this will look like. So I'll mostly be focusing on big takeaways rather than fine details, as those might change as the analysis is progressed. So first of all, a quick introduction to me. As you heard, my name is Rory. I grew up on Gabriel Island up here in British Columbia, right in the midst of the Salish Sea. You can see where we are, just across the strait from Vancouver. The Salish Sea, I'm sure everyone's aware, but it's these inner waters comprised here of the waters protected by Vancouver Island in Washington on British Columbia. Some of my earliest memories include watching as thousands of birds, fish, seals, sea lions, whales all gathered to feed on the annual herring spawn, which happens up here in the strait. And this, among other things, naturally drew my interest to ecology and conservation, which I've made into my career. In 2016, I went out to the east coast of Canada to complete my Bachelor's of Science in Biology. This is where I really began to fall in love with birds specifically, both through research and hobbyist birding. This led me to my master's degree, which I completed in 2023 at the University of British Columbia here in Vancouver in 2020. If any of you are eBird users, which I imagine some of you are out there in the crowd, your observations very likely contributed to my master's research, which used eBird data to look at competition between two local favorite species, the black-capped chickadee and the chestnut-backed chickadee. So if you're an eBird user in the crowd, extra special thank you to you. Finally, after completing my master's, I joined up with Birds Canada, where I currently work as a data analyst and am completing the research that I'll present here today. Birds Canada is a national level organization up here north of the border, which aims to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. We do that in a number of ways, organizing public engagement and educational events, administering long-term bird monitoring and conservation programs. We've got a huge team of volunteers, and we have staff that conduct scientific research with the help of all those volunteers. In most cases, such as in the Salish Sea, conservation really has to be an international and collaborative effort to be a success. Hence, I'm here talking to some folks in Washington about research that really concerns us all here in the Salish Sea. We are lucky in the Salish Sea to have a huge diversity of coastal water birds, which I'm sure you all are quite familiar with. This group includes birds like loons, grebes, cormorants, herons, swans, geese, ducks, shorebirds, and gulls. We've got many beautiful representatives of this group here in the Salish Sea. Things like this common merganser, very gorgeous fish-eating bird that's quite common around the coast here. We've got hooded mergansers, a whole diversity even within these small groups of birds. We've got scoters like the surf scoter, other diving ducks, goldeneye, long-tailed duck.
It's too loud.
This horned grebe here, among other grebe species, and not only that, but loons, cormorants. I could go on. We've got a huge diversity of incredible birds here. Why do we have so many coastal water bird species here? Well, in addition to the many species which both breed and overwinter here in the Salish Sea, we're at a really critical point along the Pacific Flyway. This is a major highway for birds that are migrating between their northern breeding grounds and their southern wintering grounds. In the winter, many coastal water birds avoid the harsher conditions up north and enjoy the abundances of food necessary to fuel their spring migration journeys, especially here around the Fraser and Columbia River deltas. At this time, birds are often feeding in the nearshore environment, bringing them into close contact with a wide range of human activities. Of course, humans really depend on the Salish Sea, with millions of people relying on these waters for their livelihood, for transportation, for recreation, as well as major ports bringing a lot of shipping activity through the region. This, in turn, confers significant pressure onto the Salish Sea ecosystem, and in turn, the birds that rely on it. That can take on a variety of forms, from chronic to acute chemical and oil pollution. We hear about these major oil spills and the terrible effects they have on birds, but the mortality caused by the long-term, low-level exposure to oil can have just as much mortality in the long term. There's direct human disturbance, things like people or their dogs chasing birds that are foraging at the beach. This also scales up to boats. As people drive by in boats, birds may make energetically costly moves like flying away or diving. There's changes in prey availability. We've heard about changes in salmon stocks, obviously, as well as herring and lots of other forage fish, which many of these birds depend on. Shoreline development is another big piece here. The nature of the shoreline here in the Salish Sea has changed dramatically, with lots of cities, highways, many other developments along the coast that has disrupted the sort of natural form of the coastline. Obviously, we've got changes in climate happening that is affecting our waters in a myriad of ways, really, from temperature to acidity to all these other things. And birds can get caught as bycatch in fishing nets, things like that. So lots of different threats coming towards birds here, our coastal water birds here in the Salish Sea. Thankfully, we have folks like you who have taken up the task of watching out for these birds, which has given us huge insights into the status of coastal water birds and how they're responding to all of these changes in the region. In Canada, up here in British Columbia, Birds Canada has been conducting the British Columbia Coastal Waterbird Survey since 1999, and we were very lucky to be joined by the Puget Sound Seabird Survey beginning in 2007. These two programs really come together to give us a very full picture of the distribution of coastal water birds in the Salish Sea that otherwise we would never have had. Since these programs share a similar methodology, we've been putting a lot of work into unifying the two data sets to allow these analyses to encapsulate the entirety of the Salish Sea, rather than being arbitrarily divided by the border. The birds don't care about the border, and so when we're trying to conserve them, we need to do as much as we can to work together on that as well. Now, all of this research and all of the work that you folks have put in has come with some real insight. One of the biggest insights is that declines are happening among coastal waterbird species here in BC, also in Washington. And these declines seem to be concentrated around what are called piscivorous and benthivorous birds. So these are birds that are feeding on fish and birds that are feeding on the seafloor in the nearshore environment. So your diving ducks, your loons, a lot of the birds that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, grebes, cormorants, all that sort of thing.
Is that what he said?
Yes, on the seafloor. That's right. So if you're out at the beach and you see a bufflehead diving, it's diving down to either catch fish at the bottom or to get things like mussels or things like that. One thing that we know, generally speaking, is that vessels may be a part of this picture. They can pose significant risks to birds. We've got evidence of this globally, lots of research in Europe, around North America, lots all around the globe, but there has actually been pretty limited study in the Salish Sea, mostly focusing on specific species or specific cases, when really we want to have as broad a picture as possible to make sure that if there are red flags anywhere, we can investigate them further. So really the thing that we don't know is how the seemingly ever-increasing vessel activity in the Salish Sea is impacting coastal waterbirds. Now, vessel activity is a big deal here in the Salish Sea. There's tons of large vessel traffic coming through to the Port of Vancouver, to ports in Seattle and Tacoma and Nanaimo and Victoria and Olympia and more and more and more. But what kinds of impacts can these vessels have? Well, as I mentioned, oil pollution, both acute in large significant spills and in sort of chronic toxic exposure to oil, can lead to mortality in birds or can just reduce their health. Energetically costly responses to vessel movement, such as diving or flying away when a boat is approaching, can drain a bird's energy, which it would otherwise use for feeding or whatever else it would normally be doing. Highly trafficked habitats, where birds are being scared off all the time or being interfered with a lot, might just be abandoned, and then that's potential habitat they could have used no longer available. Finally, there is also direct mortality from collisions when boats do strike birds. This can happen and it can lead to, unfortunately, dead birds. We think this is a really critical juncture to be looking at vessel activity because here in the Salish Sea, north of the border, we're expecting a couple of really big expansions to some of the ports in the area that are going to be bringing a lot more ships through the area. So in order to fill some gaps in our understanding, we wanted to ask the following questions. First of all, how does all of this vessel activity impact the distribution of different coastal waterbird groups? And secondly, do population trends vary between areas of low and high vessel activity? We're going to get into each of these questions more specifically and in detail. So feel free, if you don't understand it now or are unsure of what exactly we're asking, we're going to make it nice and clear. But first, just to go over kind of the approach that we've taken here. So we've taken the counts that you and our Canadian volunteers collected of coastal waterbirds across the Salish Sea. We've combined that with publicly available automated identification system data to map vessel activity. Now, this data, basically boats are required, but boats of a certain size and certain classes are required to carry transponders, which essentially send signals to satellites tracking their location. And so with all of this data, we can essentially visualize where boats are spending the most time. We know the areas of the Salish Sea down to a pretty fine resolution that are being highly trafficked by these boats. So now we've got counts of birds across the Salish Sea. We know how many boats are showing up around the Salish Sea. What we can do is we can relate that vessel activity to this metric we call occupancy. Occupancy is a metric that describes the likelihood that a particular kind of bird shows up at a particular location. It can be impacted by a lot of factors that birds use to choose where to rest, where to forage, things like that. This can be anything from the salinity of the water, the temperature of the water, how much human disturbance there is. All sorts of factors can impact occupancy. The idea with occupancy is that we can use those estimates to say, if you go to a location with these conditions at this time, you have a 50% chance of seeing this bird. Or to say things like, you are 20% less likely to find this bird at a busy, heavily trafficked beach rather than a remote one. So really, we just wanted to see whether vessel activity would impact where we see different bird species showing up. We were able to do this for 17 species, looking at the period of 2011 to 2022. Going over the species that we got to take a look at, we were able to assess all three of the region's cormorant species, the double-crested cormorant, the pelagic cormorant, and the Brandt's cormorant. We got two of the region's loon species, both the common and Pacific loon. We've got three local grebe species, including the declining western grebe, which we were really happy to be able to get into the analysis. All three of our local merganser species. We were only able to get one local alcid species. Alcids are things like auklets, murres, guillemots, and that's the pigeon guillemot. We were able to look at a pretty good range of diving duck species as well, including the long-tailed duck, the harlequin duck, Barrow's goldeneye, the surf scoter, and the white-winged scoter. So across these species, we wanted to ask, first, how does vessel activity impact the distribution of these different coastal waterbird groups? How are scoters affected? How are cormorants affected, et cetera? Our first question was essentially, we wanted to be able to compare what birds were showing up at low vessel activity sites and high vessel activity sites. For each species, we wanted to see if we ended up with a situation like this, where a species was seen much more frequently at low vessel density sites than at high vessel density sites. But we also wanted to look at the opposite situation, where a species was seen more frequently at high vessel density sites than low vessel density sites. So really, we just wanted to check, essentially, do these species tend to show up more when there's more boats around or less boats around? Could that vessel activity be having an impact? What we found was that occupancy differed between areas of low and high vessel activity in 10 of the 17 species we looked at. These affected species can be grouped into two kind of easier to remember groups. First, we've got the avoiders. These are species which avoided areas of high vessel activity, preferring less trafficked waters where there wasn't as much vessel activity. At this point, it's important to note that our research can't say for sure that it is the boats that these birds are avoiding. We're not actually out there on the water looking at the boat and seeing it chase off the bird. However, there is something in these higher vessel activity areas that is deterring birds. Given that high vessel activity areas likely have high human activity generally, places like ports, cities, it could be the boats, or it could be another threat associated with human activity, such as pollution, change in prey abundance, or the shoreline being pretty heavily developed. So some examples of these avoiders, these species that were really deterred from high vessel activity areas. Well, first, both of the loon species in the area, they were twice as likely to be found in low vessel activity sites compared to high vessel activity sites. This isn't too surprising. Research from Europe has found that other loon species tend to avoid areas of high vessel activity. And it appears that that avoidance holds here in the Salish Sea as well. The same goes for these two diving duck species, both of which were also about twice as likely to be found in low vessel activity sites compared to those high vessel activity sites. Again, here, the same European research found that scoters were quite sensitive to vessel approach, although here the pattern appears to be more species specific. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the surf scoter. That's an example of a species that showed no preference for low or high vessel activity sites. It was pretty neutral.
What?
But here we can see that the white-winged scoter seems to be avoiding those high vessel activity sites. So we don't know exactly what might drive these species-specific differences in how they respond to that high vessel activity. But we're happy to be able to identify some of these species that might be looking to avoid areas where there's high vessel activity. Now, although there were species that were avoiding areas of high vessel activity, we also have these species which seem to love areas of high vessel activity. These were the species which were found more frequently at sites with high vessel activity. Again, we're not suggesting here that these birds are actually attracted to the boats themselves, but the heightened vessel density is clearly associated with something that's drawing these species in. Again, that could be a whole range of other human factors, but we're seeing that with higher vessel density, whether it's directly from the boats or from things that are associated with them, we're seeing changes in occupancy. So these species that tended to be found more frequently in areas of high vessel activity, the cormorants, both the double-crested and pelagic cormorants seem to be the most strongly attracted to high vessel activity sites. They were found more frequently there, and as well, the pigeon guillemot. This little alcid seems to tolerate those high vessel activity sites quite well, being found more frequently there than in calmer, quieter waters. This is interesting. In the literature and in research before, or prior research, alcids like the pigeon guillemot have tended to be seen as quite sensitive to vessel activity. These are birds that really forage on those schools of forage fish, and so they quite often show up in bycatch. They respond quite drastically to vessel approach. However, we're seeing increased occupancy at high vessel density sites. So this was a bit counterintuitive to us. Yeah, it'll be interesting to uncover more about what's maybe driving these attractions. I have some ideas, but quite a bit outside the scope of this research. Additionally, we had a couple of diving duck species that seem to be attracted to these high vessel density areas. We're not exactly sure why, but for pretty much all of these species that appear to be attracted to high vessel density sites, we doubt they're going there for the boats themselves. Perhaps their prey gathers more in highly trafficked areas. Perhaps there's some difference on the shoreline that benefits them. These birds aren't just going out and boat watching and all going, getting very excited at all of the boats in the area. There's something that's benefiting them there that is associated with that higher vessel activity. So that answers our first question. We have 10 out of the 17 species we saw with significantly different occupancy between low and high vessel density sites. So vessel density clearly can either directly or indirectly, we don't know, drive occupancy among these coastal waterbird species. The next question we wanted to look at was seeing whether population trends vary between areas of low and high vessel activity. Essentially, we wanted to ask whether at more highly trafficked sites, are birds moving in or are birds moving out? Are birds doing well there or are they declining there? To visualize this a little bit, the kind of patterns we were looking for were things like this, where at the low vessel activity site, maybe the species is declining a little bit, or it's got a stable trend that's not really increasing. There's not more of them, there's not less of them, or maybe it's even increasing a little bit. What we were looking for was cases where at high vessel activity sites, we suddenly see a big decline, a big declining trend that we didn't see in those low vessel activity areas. That really gives us some insight into, okay, there's something in these high vessel activity sites. Maybe it's the boats, maybe it's something that comes with the boats that's driving a decline in this species. Again, we were also looking for the inverse case. We were looking for patterns like this, where at the low vessel activity sites, maybe they're declining, maybe they're stable, or maybe they have some small increase. But there's something about high vessel density sites that's really driving a strong increase in this species. We wanted to see whether the addition of all of this vessel activity might make declines worse or might make growth better, and how that would vary from species to species. What we found was that population trends varied notably between low and high vessel activity sites for 6 of the 17 species that we took a look at. First, we'll take a look at, I hate to call them losers, but they are sort of the losers in this situation. These are the species that are losing out at these high vessel activity sites. These are species for which declines were stronger, more pronounced at high vessel activity sites than they were at low vessel activity sites. The two that stood out, or there were 3 that stood out here, but starting with these two, we again see the white-winged scoter, who we saw earlier. So this is a species that both avoids areas with high vessel density, and populations that are in areas of high vessel density, they're declining. So what we're seeing is that these birds appear to be quite sensitive to something at those high vessel activity sites. The Salish Sea and BC has globally significant populations of white-winged scoter. So this was a finding that we were really alarmed by, and it's great to be able to identify something that really seems to drive lowering of occupancy, abandonment of sites in the white-winged scoter. We also saw that the long-tailed duck had worse trends in high vessel density sites than in low vessel density sites. We don't have much research into this bird's relationship with vessels, either from other places in North America or here. There isn't much on how these birds respond to vessels. So we're happy to be able to contribute something and say, okay, well, it seems like here vessels or areas of high vessel activity seem to be associated with worse trends in the long-tailed duck. It'll take some research to figure out exactly why, but we're glad to be able to flag it at the very least. The third species here that seems to be doing quite badly in these high vessel density sites is the western grebe. This is a species of serious conservation concern. In Washington, it's designated as a species of greatest conservation need. Since the 1970s, this species has been declining and shifting out of the Salish Sea. You can see this graph here is from a publication that came out in 2013.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, massive, massive declines that for a long time, we haven't entirely been sure about what's driving it. Prey abundance seems to be the biggest driver. Some of the fish that the western grebe really relies on, their abundance has changed quite a lot in the Salish Sea. But what we're seeing here is that the average trend, while these birds were still declining in low vessel activity sites, the average trend was more than 2 times as bad in high vessel density areas. So there's clearly something in these high vessel density sites that is making the situation even worse for the western grebe, which is the opposite of what we need right now for this species. So this was definitely a concerning result, and prompts you to think, what happens as more and more sites across the Salish Sea increase in vessel activity? This species, which appears to respond quite badly to that we need to be super concerned about, might be a cause for concern. Now, those are the three that seem to have their declines worsened in these areas of high vessel activity. But there were also winners in this situation. These are the species that are increasing more strongly at areas of high vessel activity. So these are species that appear to be benefiting relative to the sort of lower vessel activity populations around them. They seem to be doing better and better in these areas of high vessel activity. And the three big winners here that I think aren't entirely surprising are the three cormorant species in the region. The double-crested cormorant, the pelagic cormorant, and the Brandt's cormorant all showed neutral trends in low vessel activity sites. So there was no increase, there was no decrease. But at high vessel activity sites, all three of these species showed significant increases just from 2011 to 2022. Wow. So there's something happening at these high vessel density sites that's really benefiting cormorants. One interesting point here is that the Brandt's cormorant showed no difference in their overall occupancy between low and high vessel density sites, while the double-crested and pelagic did. But we do see an increasing trend here, so it's quite likely that in the future, if the sort of neutral trend at the low vessel activity areas continues, and this increasing trend at high vessel activity areas continues, that we'll start seeing more and more of the Brandt's cormorant population depending on these high vessel activity sites, like the double-crested cormorant and the pelagic cormorant do. So I'll give a little theory into why that's happening. My suspected reasoning is the growth of colonies on infrastructure associated with vessel density. These high vessel density areas also have things like bridges, docks, pilings, ports, all that sort of thing, where you see these big haul-outs of cormorants hanging out. They lay their eggs there in the breeding season, and they need a place to land and rest from foraging. This is an example from here in Vancouver. The Second Narrows Bridge, which is a bridge right by the main port here. We have the largest colony of cormorants in BC. You can see in this graph at the bottom left counts of the cormorant nests at this bridge. It's also called the Ironworkers Memorial Bridge. These are the same, one and the same. You can see that the counts of these double-crested and pelagic cormorant nests are increasing. So it seems like in the face of maybe some of the changes that are happening in the natural environment, cormorants are shifting to really depend on bridges and human infrastructure to have these huge colonies. And that might explain why we're seeing these increases in high vessel activity areas where all this infrastructure exists, but no such increase in low vessel activity.
300 cormorants that nest under the bridge?
Yep, there's 300 nests. This is a count of the nests. So if you think 2 cormorants to a nest, that's a lot of cormorants. This is a big bridge, but they're certainly making use of every nook and cranny. Okay, so that's kind of the nitty-gritty. Those are the species that are doing well, the species that aren't doing so well with vessel activity. Let's cover the takeaways. So first, generally speaking, for many coastal waterbird species, occupancy and the trend in that occupancy differs in areas of low and high vessel activity. This really does seem to be a way that populations in the Salish Sea are organizing themselves, whether they can tolerate that high vessel activity or whether they have to avoid it. While we can't draw a direct causal link with the research we've done here, vessels have well-documented impacts on waterbirds and are likely at least playing a part in the declines that we've examined here through that pollution, through disturbance, through perhaps mortality that are causing these long-term changes in occupancy where these birds are showing up. But at the same time, not all birds are avoiders. some appear to benefit from this vessel activity and its associated changes. When we think of the cormorants, double-crested cormorants were nearly extirpated from the Salish Sea due to DDT back in the 70s. And so the support that the infrastructure around ports and things like that has given them may be a really important thing in conserving those populations in the Salish Sea. So it's a complex thing. It's not exactly that we should get rid of all boats and everything. You know, some birds do benefit, and obviously there's a lot of necessity to a lot of the vessel activity. But for a second takeaway, there are species we need to be worried about as shipping traffic increases. The ones that we really highlighted here were first the long-tailed duck and white-winged scoter. Both of these species had reduced and declining occupancy in these high vessel activity areas, and stable higher occupancy in low vessel activity areas. So there's something localized to those areas of high vessel activity, probably associated with those boats, that is driving their declines. So as we see shipping traffic increasing, these are perhaps species we should keep our eye on. The western grebe, as I discussed, huge conservation concern, and the fact that it seems to be doing worse in high vessel activity areas is a real red flag, and will require some extra care. This species requires a lot of care, and in those areas with lots of vessel activity, this is one that we're going to have to keep in mind for sure. My final takeaway is that citizen science is the best. Community science is the best. All of you folks who went out and did these counts and organized these counts, none of it would have been possible without you. This work will be documented in the scientific literature. It will provide important conservation insights to the people who are making policy around the Salish Sea. Your work is contributing not only to this project, but several other projects, which I'm sure we'll hear more about down the road. We've been really, really happy to be able to collaborate with the Puget Sound Seabird Survey and really take a look at how we can conduct conservation for these species across the Salish Sea, not just north of the border for us. Working across the border is absolutely essential to conservation. If we fix something up here and it doesn't get fixed down there, the birds aren't going to benefit. And same thing the other way. If you fix something down there and we don't do it up here, the birds aren't going to benefit. So we really need to work together on this, and working on this project has been fantastic. It's been great to get to collaborate like that. Some quick acknowledgements, of course, all of the funders, both for our work here at Birds Canada, but also your great work at Puget Sound Seabird Survey. My collaborators, Dr. David Bradley, Dr. Danielle Ethier, Dr. Devin Deswan. All of you folks, again, you made this possible, and thank you so much for coming out to watch. All the volunteers at the BC Coastal Waterbird Survey, and again, the Puget Sound Bird Observatory Board and staff for making this research possible. I have some references here if anyone's interested in following up on anything they saw here. And yeah, I think that's my time. That's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you, Rory. I really appreciate it. There's a few questions and comments that have come in during the talk. John Houghton mentioned that scoters are certainly attracted to piers and pilings, as I'm sure we are. We're aware. I think John was meaning surf scoters. If John's still on, you can clarify that. And there are very large flocks of scoters, especially around piers in Mukilteo, which is just north of Seattle.
Yeah, Toby, this is John. I was around Mukilteo. There are Barrow's goldeneye predominantly, a few common, but mostly Barrows. And there have been flocks there in our CBC counts, and I expect probably also in some of the PSS data of 80 or 100 birds of Barrow's goldeneyes.
Yeah, we get a lot here in Vancouver around Stanley Park. So it seems like Barrow's goldeneye seem to tolerate these busier areas pretty well, and maybe there's something about the piers. It's attracting fish, or it's giving substrate for the shellfish and things like that that they eat to grow on. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're eating barnacles and mussels off of the pilings predominantly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Well,
We have another comment that's love to see how the data is
Mm.
making an impact. Thanks for the opportunity to learn more about your work, Rory.
Yeah.
Presentations like yours, Rory, are exactly why we do the citizen science work that we do, pulling all of the data and making it into something digestible and therefore more likely to be actionable is hugely important work. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Really
Yes,
appreciate
thank
it.
you for sure. It's all about the volunteers, as I always say. We wouldn't be able to do this without you, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. None of this.
There's a
Do I
question here
have
for you.
maps? Yeah.
Do you have maps showing what areas were designated as high or low vessel use?
Yeah. So that came from all of the data that I used for that came from this project or from this company called MapLarge, which does have an online viewer for vessel traffic data. You can see here, this one right here, globalmaritimetraffic.org. It will give you a map of every 1 kilometer square of the ocean, exactly how much vessel density they've calculated, how many hours vessels are spending in there. We went through a process of going through our sites, and essentially what we called high vessel density sites were the top 20% of those vessel density of sites. So the highest 20% of vessel density sites. Does that make sense? And those low vessel density sites were the bottom 80%. And we tried this with a couple different splitting points. So we said, okay, do the results change if we go 60-40? We say that low vessel density sites are the bottom 60% and high vessel density sites are the top. And so we did that with 60-40, 70-30, 80-20, and found the results to be pretty consistent. So there's something happening in these busier sites. But you can see the data that underlies that sort of binning process if you check out this website, globalmaritimetraffic.org.
Right, thank you. Is it possible that with the cormorant population thriving on the infrastructure, are they out competing the western grebes and adding to the grebe decline?
It could be. I mean, they'd be going for broadly the same food. That'd be an interesting point. I think it's possible, but I think the thing is the cormorants and the grebes have been here much longer than the infrastructure, and they both managed to survive well enough, right? So it's a matter of maybe there's some other factors that we need to address first before we look to competition as maybe the driving force. But I could see it being a factor among many, right? That's an interesting point.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for sharing your research, Rory. This is very worthwhile study. Thank you for raising awareness surrounding vessel traffic and impacts. Yeah, this is something I think folks aren't thinking about all the time, but as soon as you mention it, it's like, well, of course our marine waterfowl are being affected somehow. And it's not surprising to hear that western grebes are being impacted, knowing how, they prefer being in much deeper water. So that's not surprising. And yeah, seeing that graph, I've seen it a number of times. Seeing that graph is always, shocking. There's thoughts that the western grebes are not necessarily declining in population, but just moving.
Just shifting, yeah.
Yeah, shifting towards the Oregon and California coasts. Honestly, I've not actually heard any proof of that. Literally, that's all I've heard is that they're shifting their population rather than it's a decline.
Yeah,
but
this paper here, the Wilson paper that's at the bottom of the references listed here, I think is pretty much the one that makes that argument. It does cite some declines as well. The breeding population does appear to have declined, but locally to the Salish Sea, there's probably some combination of decline, of like actual population decline and shift out of the area because prey is maybe not so available here anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. Somebody's asking if you could really quickly, briefly go over the determination of the high-low vessel areas.
Yeah. Again, that's that data from the Global Maritime Traffic Density Service. Essentially, the process for that is we have those GPS points for each of the sites that you folks go out and survey. And so we use those GPS points to essentially locate the data on this big map that this website provides you. And we summarize it over a couple of years or something like that. And so we have then a value of, okay, on average, within a week, there are vessels moving around in here for this many hours. It's I think it's hours per week or hours per day that vessels are moving within the area. So we take each of those geolocated points. We now have an associated value for how much time boats are spending in there. All of that is tracked by that AIS service, which is essentially a satellite tracking service for those boats. And then among all of our sites, we took the 20 highest vessel density sites and the 80%, or the 20% highest and the 80% lowest of the vessel density sites. And that's how we made that high-low split. If there's more questions about that process, I'm happy to answer. I know I've been unclear about that in the presentation.
Well, that's great. Thank you. It's,
Sure.
you know, it's complicated. You know, you've spent a lot of time
Yeah.
about those things. It's a little complicated when you've only heard this for the first time. So appreciate
Yeah,
that.
for sure. Here's a quick example if you haven't gone to the website. This screenshot here is pulled directly from MapLarge. And so you can see each square, the redder it is, the darker red it is, the more hours vessels are spending in there. And so you can look on this map and find where your site is and say, okay, well, now I know approximately how many hours vessels are spending in the area around my site. And so that's the first step of that process on our end. We do that for each site.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll have to dive into that a little bit more. This is a great question. What can we as citizens do to help raise awareness in the plight of our seabirds and other wildlife that live in increasingly busy shipping traffic areas? How can we apply what we're learning here?
Yeah, I think really the thing is some of these birds are so invisible to people. I feel like we've all had that moment where we had our life before birding and then after birding where suddenly we see all of these birds that are around us all the time, and we can, as we start to be able to identify them individually, each individual species starts to matter to us more. And so I think the number one biggest thing you can do to help raise awareness is it's as simple as making people aware, right? If you've got friends who are birding curious, take them out with you, show them what these different bird species are. You can really, I don't know, bring these birds visibility just by pointing them out to people and by spreading the word about the hobby of birding. I think once people get into birding, I feel like 99% of them get into conservation as well. They kind of come one and the same. So I think especially for these birds that are further offshore, or maybe you have to go out on those rainy, cold mornings to go and find at the beach, see if you can bring your friends along to that. See if you can just bring those birds into people's lives when they wouldn't otherwise be. I think that's how you spread the word, how we raise awareness.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very nice study. You found some important correlations of vessel traffic to bird populations and presence in the water. I hope it can have an impact on conservation efforts as we try to control vessel traffic to slow down to avoid orcas. It will also help birds. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
For sure. Everyone benefits. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Yeah, the final results of this are still in development. And I'm sure word will be sent around once the publication comes out.
Is there a timeline on that? What's the Yeah, what are you looking
Don't have an exact timeline, but we're resubmitting with the revised results
Okay.
in sort of the next month. So hope so. I mean, should be this year, all things going, all things going according to plan. Yeah, so but we'll make sure that everyone knows when that comes out.
Yeah,
Maybe
for
I can
sure.
come back with the final details.
Okay, yeah, and we'll share that broadly with everybody once it comes out.
Awesome, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rory. Really appreciate your time on this, but also your presentation this evening.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Obviously, we love to let the volunteers know how their data is being used, all the time
Yes,
and
thank you.
effort they've spent out there. So also a big thank you to all you volunteers. Really appreciated. I know it's been really cold recently, so hope you're wrapping up warm. And of course, we've got the survey coming up in a couple of weeks. One notice to everybody: please keep your completed data sheets after you've done your surveys. I am going to start asking for those to be sent back to me at the end of the season, so please keep hold of those. Anyway, yes, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Rory, and we'll call that to a close. And we'll be sharing this so you guys can rewatch this at your leisure. And yes, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the time.
Okay, thank you.
And Rory, can you send me the recording once once
Yeah.
it's loaded?
Yeah, I have to figure out how to end that.
You'll have to control
Okay,
mute.
stop recording.